Next question, David Duyet says, what do you think about the iGPU deal between Intel and AMD? As I understand it, that's not actually confirmed by anyone, so I don't have any thoughts on it. I think that's a rumor right now. I think I talked about that on Joker's TGW show, and it was basically, at the time, was a rumor that was popularized by Kyle Bennett of Hard OCP. He's certainly been in the industry a while. He's got some credibility behind him, but he's still the source, the start and the end of the statement. So I really have no thoughts or comments on it. Next question. I don't have this commenter's name written down, but we'll go find it and put it in the normal place. Next question was basically about a Xeon versus an i7 and when it makes sense to buy one versus the other. So Xeon CPUs are kind of a hidden secret in system building if you're building enthusiast systems, because you can often get them a bit cheaper than an i7, and they're mostly similar in some ways. So it's a good way to save some money, but you do sacrifice a bit. So one example would be, well, first of all, Xeons and i7s in the recent generations, as long as you're not going with some crazy $5,000 CPU that really has some specific requirements for what it needs, the more equivalent to i7 Xeons will work on mainstream motherboards and chipset platforms. So that makes them interesting as a buying option and to save some money or to thwart stock issues. But the things you sacrifice, a Xeon has no IGP, which is something that almost, I'm sure, all of you do not care about. So that's one area where it's good. You lose the IGP. If you already are buying a DGPU, then who cares? You can use that die space for something more important, like in the case of the Xeon, higher cache. And more cache will help in production workloads and other specific applications, rendering applications, modeling, stuff like that, simulation. That can help there. Not going to be a massive impact to games. What will impact games more is frequency, as kind of stated a second ago. And with frequency, the Xeons tend to be lower clocked, and they're not really overclockable in the way that an i7 whatever would be. An i7 case 6700K for the current generation or something like that. So there's some sacrifices and some good. The good is maybe a bit cheaper. You get more cache, you might get more cores, depending on which ones you're looking at. And that could be helpful if you're building a machine that will at least part-time double as a production system. You lose the frequency and you lose the overclocking, but if you care about neither of those, then I guess it's a good buy. But again, dropping frequency will impact gaming performance. Oh, and the IGP, which is useless for the most part anyway, other than QuickSync or something like that. Next question, Ricky Chong says, if AMD's Zen will flop, do you think that Intel will jack up their prices? I think Intel's prices are probably about where they will stay. Intel's way more worried about people like ARM and Qualcomm right now. I don't know that AMD has really posed that much of a threat in the last few years to Intel. Certainly with Zen, they would pose more of a threat, but I think Intel's a lot more worried about other competitors right now than they're kind of, it's a smaller market, it's established, and there's not a lot of innovation in it compared to things like mobile or server, enterprise. So I think that's where their efforts are focused right now. But in terms of if Zen flops, I don't really want to speculate on that too much, because I don't like speculating on how a product will perform before I even know how it performs in terms of benchmarking. But you know, let's say that Zen doesn't do great. I don't think it's going to change things a whole lot, because the market's already pretty heavy on Intel right now. If you look at just the market share of Intel CPUs, the only thing, I only see this going in a direction of AMD gaining more market share or remaining the same. I don't know that they'll lose a whole lot. If they do, then there's other issues that we'll talk about at that point, but I don't think that's really a main point of concern right now. So will they increase their prices? I would have to say probably not. If anything, they're going to stay the same, most likely stay the same, maybe go down a little bit if they're starting to feel some pressure from Zen, which would be a great thing, especially at the high end where you've got Ryzen competing with the Broadwell chips, Broadwell E chips. That would be a good thing, but no, I think the answer to that is no. Next question is, Pixelist says, Dear GN, I overclocked my 6700K to 4.5 gigahertz with a 1.35 V core, and I start monitoring programs like CPU-Z. Voltage seems to go all the way up to 1.4 under load. That's not a huge fluctuation. When I use CPU ID, it is constant at 1.6. Double checked BIOS and it's set to 1.35. Yeah, so what you're seeing is it could be a few things without knowing your motherboard and other settings. There's a couple CPU settings in BIOS that you should check. Things like EIST and C states. And there's a couple other OC settings, again, depending entirely on around a 6700K, so I guess we're probably on Z170. So you want to check C states and things like that. Generally, your voltage is going to look more variable depending on the software you're using to monitor it. So I would recommend something like AIDA64 and what's that other one? Hardware Info 64, I think. Both of those are, in my experience, pretty accurate with voltages. I would use those to monitor. CPU-Z should be accurate as well. But Hardware Info 64 and AIDA64 are the two I would get, and then it could be you're looking at different voltage values. CPUs have more than one voltage value, so make sure it is actually V-Core for all the software you're using to validate, because you may be looking at a different voltage value. And then the update frequency as well for the software can be different. So if you put two solutions next to each other, two programs on your desktop, you have CPU-Z here, and AIDA64 and Hardware Info 64. If they're updating at different frequencies, which some of them you can tune, like AIDA you can change, and some you can't. If they update at different frequencies, then they might be three different numbers, even though they're all presenting the data to you at the same time. They might have checked it at a different time, and so that would cause another disparity. But the CPU will also, to some extent, change its voltage based on the current need. So moving from 1.35 to 1.4, I would not say is a huge deal. Moving from 1.35 to 1.6 is a much bigger difference, but I would start with checking the software. Next question, Smokey Dops says, what's your guys' take on FDM and 3D printers? I predict a slide we see at the New Horizons event will include a red-black AMD branded bracket around the processor sample, and those would be 3D printed. I've no doubt an R&D company would be using 3D printers, but how about you? We don't use them. I don't have one. I have used them, and we did one video on 3D printers several years ago at a Maker Faire event. Maybe two, but I mean, they're cool. I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on them, to be honest. We kind of focus on component, so that is out of my expertise. But I did want to bring it up because the point here that's interesting, 3D printing brackets and things like that, that's something we've seen. It hasn't really taken off yet, and I'm trying to remember some of the other places we've seen that, where companies have offered semi-modular components. But that's attempted to be a thing lately, especially with shrouds for different products, brackets, stuff like that, GPU cooling solutions. I haven't really seen it take off though. Oh, headsets as well. There's been a lot of headsets we've looked at lately at trade shows where one of their big points is you could 3D print the external ear cup cover if you wanted a logo or something on it. But it doesn't seem to have taken off in the enthusiast market just yet. Pretty cool, but definitely out of my expertise. Last question is from whoever that guy is. He's returned. He's been out for at least 10 episodes now. Whoever that guy is, maybe hopefully has improved since last time. Says, sup Steve, it's been a while. Anyway, I installed this newest NVIDIA driver and it optimized all my neatly tuned graphics settings. How do I optimize your hairstyle? That's it for this episode of Ask GN. As always, leave your questions in the comment section below. And subscribe for more content. We have a few interesting things coming up this week. It's going to be a bit of a lighter week at the end of it. Holidays and all that. But looking at, hopefully, an in-win. I think it's the 805 Infinity, which we showed you all at Computex or CES or one of those shows. CES, I believe, almost a year ago now. So looking at the 805 Infinity properly, and we'll be looking at some internal solutions that I've been building up for compressing our media and working with the NAS. So check back, as always, subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. As always, leave your questions in the comments below, but quick note here, there's a new rule, I guess we'll call it. Because there are so many questions on these videos now, I'm still reading every single comment for Ask GN videos, but it would help me tremendously if you could upvote and downvote the comments with questions that you think deserve most to be answered. I'm still going to go through all of them, so it'll be as democratic as possible, but it just will make me immediately know, okay, this is what people are interested in this week. So please do that. I got to get the cat hair off the table. We've got a video on OCAT that just went up, working on more of it, so that's still in flux. But let's start off with the Ask GN content. So for the first question, we've got one from Covenant11, who says, Dear GN, what is it about Crysis 3 that keeps benchmark junkies using it as a benchmark even as we approach the 4-year anniversary of its release? What features and options is it about the engine that keeps this game pushing the hardware? Crysis is definitely abusive in a lot of ways in terms of visual effects and the geometry, all kinds of stuff in there, tessellation. So that's one reason. We don't really use it. I know that at least a couple outlets use it for maximum power load testing, staring at a skybox. I test power draw a different way, but it does put a lot of strain on the GPU, on the system in total. So for a couple of reasons, it's good to keep around old games. If you worked on Crysis years ago when it came out and you've worked on it since then, it's not a bad thing to keep around. And the same is true for us with Metro Last Light, with, in the past, Grid Autosport. That lived on our benchmarks for years, and a couple of other games as well. Shadow of Mordor. Some people sometimes will ask, why did you guys waste your time benchmarking Shadow of Mordor or Metro Last Light? No one plays them. That's not really the point. We benchmark games like GTA, Battlefield, Gears of War, whatever happens to be new, so that you can see what the performance is on a game that you play. But games like Metro and Shadow of Mordor we keep around so we have a look backwards in time, and that can be used later for really important things. For example, let's say we wanted to do a driver benchmark where we're looking at how do the drivers impact performance of these cards, maybe the 700 and the 200 series cards, over the period of 3 years or whatever it may be. We can do that with Metro Last Light and Shadow of Mordor because I've already got all that data. I don't have to sit there and pull drivers from 3 years ago and rerun it all. We have all the data on the same platforms even. So that's pretty useful. Now, it's also useful because with these games, two more reasons. One, they're never updated, so you don't have to worry about a sudden game patch like with Doom just requiring that you rerun all tests, which really sucks. But it's important to do because when a patch comes out and it increases and changes performance, obviously you can't recycle your old data. We talked about this in a previous video. But or you could, but you shouldn't if you're comparing new data with it. So we try to keep the data the same age as much as possible, and using older games helps with that, and mix in a few newer games that are popular at the time. Now, another reason you would use Crysis 3 as a benchmark is because Crysis 3, or for us Metro Last Light, both games, we know very well where a particular card should fall on the chart based on just sort of intuition with benchmarking all the other cards. So if I know this card has X shaders, X CUDA cores or stream processors or whatever, has X shaders and it has Y memory and it has Z whatever else, clock rate, I know it should fall between these three cards. So that's a really powerful tool for benchmarking and for figuring out rapidly if your numbers look good, because more cat hair, if the numbers don't look good, we just shot a video with Snowflake on the table, because if the numbers don't look good, you want to find out immediately. That way you're not wasting your time running through all the other benchmarks. So that's probably why some outlets still use Crysis 3. I never jumped on it when it was new because we weren't really doing that yet. but Metro is kind of my equivalent of of Crisis 3, and then Shadow of Mordor is in there as well, though we've kind of moved away from that recently. Next question is Obzen, who says, do you think the price of MLC and TLC NAND will continue to rise into 2017 and beyond? Prices keep climbing with no end in sight, it seems. So this is a topic that comes up pretty much every 2 years, and it's normally with RAM, but kind of in the same boat with SSDs. It's just SSDs are more visible now than they used to be. This is not something I've studied as closely as other outlets, and I'll give a shout out here. Tom's Hardware has probably the best article on these SSD NAND prices. I'm not going to go ahead and try and compete with them. You can just check their article on that for information. If you search Tom's Hardware SSD NAND prices, I'm sure it'll be top result. So what they were saying, and all of this I agree with, is that adoption in mobile, in notebook, and in desktop is at an all-time high for NAND. And if you don't know what NAND is, we have a video on it that explains what it is, has animations and everything. But basically, because one, prices were lower than ever for SSDs, and two, in notebooks and laptops, you can decrease the size, you get a smaller form factor, you decrease the power consumption pretty considerably, considering what's actually in there. It's already low power consumption. A hard drive, 2.5-inch drive even, is still drawing a decent amount of power compared to the rest of the components, when an SSD might be a watt or less if it's idle. So that's a big reason. And I guess, speed. So because of these things, and because SSDs have kind of proven themselves in the market now, there's a lot more people buying them for desktop, but there's a tremendous amount of NAND being used in phones right now, and NAND being used in just flash memory being used in notebooks. Basically every Mac notebook, and a good deal of Windows or Linux or whatever, any other notebook out there, but especially Apple right now. So with that, your prices are going to go up, and I don't have an end in sight. I'm sorry. So Tom's talks about it a bit more. You can read more there for information. Next question is Chris Arellano, aka Hellguiden, I suppose, who says, what's the oldest processor you have lying around, and what did it come out of? Where did it come from? I still have one from my first PC, a Pentium 3. It's funny to look at now compared to current stuff. First to note, we did a tour of the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. You should definitely search for a Computer History Museum on our channel, because I was joined by Jim Vincent, who is, for all intents and purposes, a computer historian. He's been in this industry for eons, and he's been programming since the start. So he talks in that video about some really old processors, and that's kind of fun. We go through like the Cray supercomputer era and before it even. The oldest stuff I have an X386 system somewhere in an attic, but the oldest one that's actually accessible and ready to use would probably be a Pentium 4 from around, I want to say 2004 maybe, somewhere in 2003 to 2005 area. And that processor I keep around because it was to my knowledge, the first consumer available hyper-threaded CPU. There might have been one other one, but I think that was the first one. At least that was in my pricing at the time. So that is a Pentium 4 something. I don't have the model number. Hyper-threaded. So it was the first poor man's dual core, basically, that was really available. And I think from memory, it had quite a few issues at launch, but I think they kind of smoothed it over. It was an interesting time. That was not far off from when AMD got their Athlon 64. Just recently, I reread the review on Nanotech or Nontech about the 64-bit Athlon, the Athlon 64, because it's actually a really critical point in history. I didn't know a lot about it because I was really into the detailed part of computers at that point, so I wanted to reread it and learn from a historical perspective what it did. It's a good article. You should read it if you haven't. But yeah, my old was probably a Pentium 4 with hyper-threading. And I don't know, it's a P-series chipset, I think. Still got the system too. It was in an Antec Landboy maybe? Not the Landboy Air that came out in the last few years, but a Landboy, the silver one with the blue plastic grill thing on the front and the tray in it that held the screws. So if you ever tipped it upside down, it would dump all the screws into your case and short something. That was the case it was in. Next question, Tech Pascal, who says, thanks again for answering my previous question. My new question is, how are games optimized, and what determines if a game is poorly optimized? For example, Survival barely runs at 60 frames per second on my Titan XP at 1080p max settings. That's really, I have not tested that game. That's impressive in some ways, I guess. Is this due to poor optimization of the game, or is the game that graphically demanding? How can you tell? A few things. So on the graphics side, a lot of optimization, most optimization happens at the developer house, and some of it happens in the drivers, especially for older APIs like DX11, where there's more driver-side optimization. How can you tell? Well, if you look at things like geometry, how smooth are the objects in the game, how detailed are they? You can look at meshes. So in GTA 5, if you scale the mesh quality, you'll see on top of some cars like Jeeps, we just know, Andrew, the camera guy, just noticed this yesterday, in our Relive versus Shadowplay video. You should go watch that, and you'll see on top of the Jeep there's some headlights. And they're not there on the AMD device, and that's not because we changed the settings, but it's because of a mesh quality tuning feature that AMD has in their drivers we'll talk about later. But the point is, that's part of the mesh quality. So if you were to scale settings back, those types of things would disappear. So in your games, you can look at these really small objects like that, like headlights, or in Black Ops 3, from memory, I remember there was a tank, and you lost some of the roundness of the turret on the tank, because it's not like an actual thing that's used in the game. So you're really not supposed to pay attention to it. But if you stare at it and you change the mesh quality, it'll turn more square as you go. Those types of things impact the performance, because the more primitives you have, the more polys you have, the more tessellation there is, the heavier. And that's pretty easy to look at and tell. Now the other things, you could look at like how smooth are the shadows, if it's forcing anti-aliasing and stuff like that. Some games force AA. Texture resolution. Some games will go crazy with texture resolutions and do like 4K textures when it's totally unnecessary for something like a chair. So it looks freaking great if you go like prone and stare at the chair leg, but totally unnecessary. So that kind of stuff does eat into VRAM, specifically with texture resolution. And then the rest of it, like geometry, that's really heavy on the shaders. Post-processing stuff kind of happens at the end of the pipeline, as the name would suggest. The rasterization is in there as well, with video and article on that. Now, as far as the optimization side of things, it is largely the game developer's job to figure out, how do I make this look good and keep this quality, but not make it kill my computer or my client or my customer's computer, whatever it may be. So what they can do, there's software like Algorithmic, which works. They actually, I think they're represented by the same firm that represents Fmod. If you've seen that logo, it's for audio. But software like that will help developers to do things like build textures that have multiple, basically sample sizes, multiple resolutions that can easily be deployed. So you have really good LOD scaling, level of detail scaling. So what happens is, as they build one texture in effectively an infinite resolution, almost vector-like box, they can save it out, and it can be saved as 16K, 4K, 2K, 256, and all the way down the chart, so that lower-end hardware is better supported. So that's optimization on the game side. You can also do things like cull useless triangles, cull primitives, cull the really anything that's either not going to be seen or appreciated by the player, get rid of it. And that's, again, on the developer side. So that's where optimization comes in. Driver side, the driver developers, which would be the IHVs or NVIDIA and AMD, they go through and they say, the way that this developer is executing this particular effect doesn't work well with our shaders and the way that the architecture is structured around them. And so we are going to change it so that it does. That's how it happens on the driver side. Next question is from Stealth1. Says, question, what kind of lifespan should people expect with closed loop liquid coolers? I've had a Corsair H100 since 2013. It's been running great. When should I consider replacement? Are there any signs to be on the lookout for, such as pump failure? Originally had this on the 3770K, and now it's 700K. Yeah, so we talked about this briefly in the past as well, but just to refresh everyone, a lot of the Asetek coolers have a bit of a lifespan of about 5 years. That's pretty much the industry standard. The new NZXT Kraken coolers have a warranty of 6 years. You can actually expect them to last that long. And basically, though, it's around 5 years plus or minus 1, depending on which supplier and which generation of pump you go with. For signs to look out for, that's the important part. You should probably, if you have, this is what I do. Work with so many, I've seen probably 3 or 4 fail at this point. And it does, they work great. Nothing works better than an AIO if you want something fast, cheap to deploy, and way better than air for the most part. There's some exceptions, but good AIO will be better than decent air, good air even. So when I deploy them, I set up at least something like SpeedFan, but ideally use a bit more advanced software. But SpeedFan at the least is free, and it does check the core temperature. A little inaccurate with AMD. That's just all software at this point. It doesn't necessarily read the AMD temperatures perfectly. Intel works fine. AMD, I need to research still. But generally, you'll at the very least, even with AMD, it is inaccurate in a consistent way. I don't know how much of that is software versus AMD and what they have on their chip for diodes. But the point is it's inaccurate in the same way. And so if you're seeing a temperature, even on AMD hardware, it often reports below ambient for me. So let's say it says the temperature is 20°. Probably not real, but whatever. Let's say it is. And that's what it says for the entire 3 years you use the cooler. One day it says 40°. Well, you know there's a problem. And the thing you can do with a cooler, best thing you do, monitor temperatures occasionally and listen for noise. When it starts making a lot of pump noise, there could be a few things. One, you might have the tubes oriented incorrectly, and check the manual for that. It could be that the liquid has begun permeating the tubes, and that's just what happens with these. The liquid, it doesn't necessarily evaporate, but it permeates into the rubber, and so the plastic or the rubber tubing over time will pull enough of that liquid out of the actual loop that it starts to lose its performance. The pump has to work in ways that it wasn't designed to work, and you get pump noise, normally gurgling, things like that. And that will happen with some of the like the Kraken X41 series Asetek coolers made some of that gurgling on and off throughout life, no matter what, even if they're fine. So don't be too alarmed. But if you hear it a lot, then maybe look into a replacement. You can also touch the tubes near where they connect to the pump, and if they feel hot, it really should not feel hot. If it feels like it's about the same temperature as the backplate of your video card, then it's time for replacement, because that means either one, it's operating way out of spec, you need a better cooler anyway, or two, the pump's just not really working anymore, and it's not pushing the liquid through fast enough to cool down. It sits there in the tubes and heats up really fast. So that's what you can look out for. I'm sure there's more things, but that's the short version of it. So as always, Patreon link in the post video if you want to help us out directly. Leave questions in the comment section below. Please upvote and downvote them to help me find the good ones. Ideally, we just use the upvoting system. Just push all the good ones to the top, and everyone's happy and everyone gets a thumbs up. But I guess that's not really how YouTube works. So either way, help me out. Push the good ones up. You can tweet at us too with short questions. And subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time. This week has been a surprisingly busy news week for hardware. Normally towards the end of the year, generally we expect it to calm down a little bit, especially this year since it's been non-stop since May around Computex time, but it's still going. This week for news, we've got some interesting updates on the RX 460, suddenly becoming a bit more relevant with some unlocking via BIOS functionality, of course unofficial. And there's AMD Ryzen, which we covered in another video, some interesting SSDs from Corsair, and more. But before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by MSI and their new Core Frozer L CPU cooler, which you can see in our new case testing bench. We've been using that lately for the new case reviews, and you've probably seen it at this point. But let's get straight into it. So first off, the most interesting item, at least that I think, is the RX 460 unlocking. This was found by Der Bauer, one of the overclockers. He's sort of peers with Buildzoid. You're mostly all familiar with Buildzoid at this point from Actually Hardcore Overclocking. Der Bauer is one of his counterparts. He's an overclocker. He's found that you can unlock the RX 460s from the native 896 cores to a 1024 core count, and that of course includes an increase in TMUs because you're probably unlocking a full block basically on the GPU. So that goes from 56 TMUs to 64. Pretty good gain in terms of both core count and TMUs, and that actually will reflect in performance. I'm not going to talk about how much just yet because I actually want to test it myself, but we will be doing a guide this weekend, hopefully, on how to unlock an RX 460. It currently only works for, as far as we're aware, the Sapphire Nitro 4GB card and Asus Strix 4GB card. It may work for other devices, but as far as we know right now, the BIOS unlocks, the mods, which you can apply just through normal flashing tools, are only available for those two devices in particular. But we'll have a guide on how to do that, and then some benchmark performance with preliminary information on the gains. Do note one thing here, the AMD Relive drivers do impact some of the unlocks that have been applied in custom BIOS installations elsewhere. So it might impact these. It's really hard to say now if AMD is going to be validating BIOS going forward with their drivers. That could pose a problem for things like this, but it's too soon. Very quickly, I will mention that AMD Ryzen, the Zen architecture update, was streamed this week. We have a separate video on it. If you want to learn more about it, go there. And that is the 8-core, 16-thread CPU, 3.4 gigahertz. They put it against an i7-6900K Broadwell E CPU from Intel and had mostly parity in terms of performance. So that is covered in our other video, including some caching discussion. Next topic. This one is from a company that honestly I'd never heard of until I checked my email just before this video. A company called Zadak 511 is producing a new kit of just more RGB stuff. So it's DDR4 RGB memory, and then the part that I thought was interesting enough to at least show was the RGB SSD, and it's basically got sort of one zone, I think, with an isolating bar down the middle. It lights up on either side of it and is controllable via software for both the DRAM and the SSD, so you can actually control the cores through software. It doesn't require extra cables. A few interesting things here. First of all, Zadak 511, of course, instantly I was like, who the heck are they? Is this some fly-by-night company? Went and looked it up using a quick whois. Their domain was registered in December of 2015. They're pretty new, about a year old at this point, and it is owned by Apacer, which is actually a known company in memory, and is a Taiwanese company. So they're based in Taiwan, they're owned by Apacer, and they were created about a year ago. It's focused on modding. Now, with that said, the new devices are called the Shield. I've reached out and asked for price, availability, what controller was used, what NAND was used, all of these things, because they didn't tell us anything about it other than the fact that they have LEDs, which I suppose is all you need to know these days. So I don't have that information just yet, but worth pointing them out. The memory we know clocks at 2400 megahertz at the low end. They go up to 3000 megahertz kits, sold in capacities up to 64 gigabytes. DDR4, not too exciting there. SSD I know nothing about because they didn't tell us anything. And then we know that well, that's not true. There's one interesting thing about the SSD that's worth noting, and that is it is a dual interface SSD. Now, that's not you can use them jointly and get expanded throughput or anything crazy like that, which would be interesting. But it's just that you basically get a USB Type-C connector on it, so 3.1 Type-C, and then there's also the standard SATA 3 connector. Now, in theory, with USB 3.1 Type-C, you get a bit more throughput than on SATA 3, which is kind of a dying/needs-to-die interface for SSDs. But it depends on the controller and the NAND how much of that extra bandwidth actually be utilized. So that's from Zadak. I'm not going to recommend necessarily pre-ordering that stuff, but we might look at it, and if we do, then we can figure out then if it's worth it. It does remind me a bit of a Vexer, though. Also in SSD news, You may have seen on our website this week that one of our writers, Eric Hamilton, covered the SSD price increases that are expected. So I very briefly mentioned this in an Ask GN video, and a couple of folks commented things like, doesn't affect me because I just bought this SSD for this great price, and obviously SSD prices are fine. That's not really what's going on here. What's going on is somewhere in the range of 2017 to 2018, you should expect an increase in both SSD prices and hard drive prices, at least at the higher end. And that's because of two things. On the SSD side, the manufacturing is increasing so much that obviously there's a supply shortage or can't keep up with demand. And most of that's going to mobile. And then on the hard drive side, there's just a lot of the factories are spinning down because hard drives sort of are spinning down, especially in consumer. That's not the main point of bringing this topic up, though. The main point of bringing up the SSD prices, because we already covered this in the article if you're curious to learn more about that and why it's going on. Main reason is because Corsair's also got a new SSD, so I guess they're going to have fierce competition from ZADAC 511. Really need to watch their backs there. Corsair's SSD is a revival of the Force series. You may remember their Force series from years ago. Corsair sort of abandoned that market, which being a memory manufacturer was an interesting move to say the least. But it seems like they're trying to come back. So they're coming back, reviving the Force series with the MP500 M.2 SSD, and that is an NVMe drive that lives on 4 PCIe lanes. So that would put it theoretically with its Phison controller. I don't know what the NAND is right now, but we know it's a Phison E7 controller. That would theoretically put it in competition about where the Samsung 960 EVO is right now. And the advertised specifications is all I can go off of. We haven't tested it, and so you know, grain of salt and all of that. But the advertised specifications they've given us.
Hello, we are fucking early in the morning and we're going to a rave right now. I'm so tired. We got like 4 hours sleep. I don't know how we're gonna do today.
I love something more. I love something.
We got cute little heart stamps. I love how we decorated everything. Everything looks so cute.
Oh, you make me wanna talk back to you. Say it like that. If I hate you, then find someone new. Baby, but you know I never will. No, so I choke you.